Somewhere in America right now, there are people living who have eaten human flesh. They paid for it, came back for seconds, and to this day, they have no idea. This isn't an urban legend or an internet horror story, but a real criminal case from Maryland in the 90s. A roadside burger stand. Cheap, just $1. Truckers, laborers, random passers-by. Everyone stopped there. The owner was a massive man, good-natured in appearance, always with a smile. Strange, but seemingly harmless. The business operated for years, and then he was caught, by accident, through a different case, and he started talking, on his own, without pressure, because he wanted everyone to know. When the details surfaced, the local media did a strange thing. They went silent. Ready-made segments never aired. Newspapers limited themselves to a couple of paragraphs, not because of censorship, but because the editors didn't know how to tell a story in which the victims weren't only those to whom everything happened, but also those who later ate. But to understand how such a thing was even possible. How a man for years did what he did, butchered his finds, and sold the meat in the open. One must first understand the place where it happened. South Baltimore is not the city shown in tourist guides, nor is it the one seen by the residents of the prosperous northern neighborhoods. There are no waterfronts with restaurants, no historic streets, nothing worth visiting specifically. There is an industrial zone that stretches along the highway for tens of kilometers. Warehouses, pallet recycling factories, truck stops, cheap motels where rooms are rented by the hour, and people who are traditionally ignored. And it was right here, along the road, especially closer to nightfall, that women would appear. They waited for cars, sometimes got in, sometimes returned, and sometimes did not. This was their neighborhood, their territory, their rules, and outsiders tried not to interfere. The police visited rarely, and not because it was safe, quite the opposite. It was just that this neighborhood had long since stopped being anyone's priority. Calls from here were processed last. Patrols drove past without stopping, and everyone understood. The people living here had long since been written off by the system. Under the Hanover Street Bridge was a so-called tent city, an unofficial camp for those with nowhere else to go. Homeless people, people with addictions, people fresh out of prison. They lived in their own closed world, sharing food, sharing what they managed to get, sometimes sharing shelter. The police knew about this camp, but as long as nothing serious came from there, they preferred not to intervene. Such places exist in any big city, zones where a person can vanish and no one will notice. For most residents of Baltimore, this neighborhood simply did not exist. They drove past on the highway, saw the warehouses, saw the trucks, saw the motels with blinking signs, and drove on without turning. A transit landscape, a backdrop outside the window, nothing more. But for those who lived and worked here, it was their whole life, and that life was cheap. The women along the highway knew each other, knew who came out at what time, which cars were best not to stop. They had their own safety system, verbal, informal, but more or less functioning. If someone didn't show up for several days, they might ask acquaintances, might start to worry. But they almost never filed a police report because they understood no one would look for them anyway. Many of them did not exist for the system. Some had no documents. Some had open cases for possession or petty theft, and going to the station meant risking their freedom for a ghost of a chance at help. And so, in the early 90s, women began to disappear here. No one missed the first one. Her name was, though it didn't matter then, because her name would only appear in records several years later. But in 1994, she simply stopped showing up at her usual spot along the highway. Acquaintances noticed this on the third day, asked someone if they had seen her, shrugged, and decided she probably left, or went to rehab, or was lying somewhere, as in Jane Doe after an overdose. This happened regularly here, and they had long since grown accustomed to it. Then another disappeared, then another. And here is what's important to understand. The pattern at that moment was completely unobvious. The women didn't disappear consecutively. Weeks, sometimes months, passed between disappearances, and they weren't directly connected. They worked in different parts of the district, had different regular clients, and led different lifestyles. The only thing that united them was the place. All were from South Baltimore. All worked along the highway. All existed on the edge of the system, where it's easy to fall through a crack and never get out. By 1995, the count was at least 5, maybe more. No one kept official statistics because the police didn't open cases. To open a case, a report is needed, and a report is filed by family. But these women either had no families at all, or their relatives had long since stopped looking for them and had crossed them out of their lives. So, some of those who worked in the same area began talking among themselves, not with the police, but specifically among themselves. A feeling emerged that was difficult to put into words. Not panic, but rather an anxiety that could be neither confirmed nor denied. Simply, too many familiar faces, one after another, stopped appearing. The theories discussed back then were quite mundane. A pimp from the East was taking them away to another state, or they were leaving themselves without saying goodbye. That was common here. Or, what seemed the simplest explanation, a bad batch, an overdose in some abandoned house, and no one found them. No one identified them. These versions were comforting. They fit into the familiar picture of the world and required no action. Everything had, as it were, explained itself. Fate, lifestyle, professional risks. But one detail bothered those who knew the district truly well. Usually, when a person disappears, at least something remains. Things in a room, a bag with a friend, a debt at a motel, some kind of traces. There are always traces. But here, nothing. The women disappeared as if they had never existed at all. No belongings remained, no witnesses remained, not even rumors remained about who they left with or where exactly they went. That doesn't happen, because if a person leaves, they tell at least someone. If they get into trouble, at least some trace remains. Here, there was only a void. But, as it would later turn out, someone did see them. He saw them every day, knew them by name, talked to them, joked, and gave them cigarettes. His name was Joe Metheny, although the locals called him Tiny. And the irony of that nickname was obvious to anyone who saw him, nearly 6 feet 2 inches tall, weighing over 450 pounds. A massive man with a broad face that, for some reason, was immediately disarming. He lived in a trailer right on the grounds of the pallet factory where he worked. The company Joe Stein and Son was engaged in wood recycling, pallet repair, and loading, and Metheny was in good standing with the management there. He worked as a forklift driver, arrived on time, never complained, and often did more than was required of him. The trailer stood right on the property because it was more convenient for everyone, and their owners didn't object to this arrangement. Effectively, Metheny lived at work, which saved him rent and gave him a freedom that most workers in this district simply didn't have. He was a regular at the corner bar. He'd stop by after his shift, grab a beer, sit at the bar, and talk to everyone. He joked, and his jokes were simple, sometimes coarse, but harmless. Typical working-class neighborhood humor that people laughed at willingly. The bartender poured for him on credit when he was short before payday, and no one saw anything strange in this. The women from the highway also knew him, and although he wasn't a regular client, he was considered one of their own. He always said hello, sometimes gave a ride if he saw someone he knew on the shoulder, shared cigarettes, and occasionally food. He never pressured, never hit on them, never haggled for services. And so, in a district where most men perceived these women exclusively as a commodity, Metheny seemed like a pleasant exception. A big, clumsy guy who just wanted to chat. Harmless, a bit lonely, maybe even kind in his own way. He didn't arouse suspicion. Quite the opposite. He aroused sympathy. And in a place where trust was a rarity, he was actually trusted. Now, it's important to understand that Metheny knew this territory better than anyone else in the area. He knew which parts of the factory were empty at night, where the guards didn't walk, what the schedule was for the trucks that drove past. He knew every woman working that stretch of the highway knew their names, their habits, their routes. And he understood perfectly well that here, one could do practically anything, and no one would know. The factory was huge. Stacks of pallets, mountains of lumber, machinery, territory that was physically impossible to fully control. At night, it was empty, with only Metheny in his trailer in the middle of this industrial space. He was 40 years old. He was completely alone, and he had a reason to hate women, a reason he told no one at the time. In 1994, Metheny had something like a family. He lived with a woman. They had a son together. Not a marriage in the official sense, but some kind of routine, some stability, a trailer for two, and a feeling that life was finally moving somewhere. And then he returned from one of his hauls, and the trailer was empty. She had left, taken their son, left no note, didn't say where or to whom, just vanished. Much the same way women across this district would later vanish. Only then he didn't yet know that these stories would turn out to be connected. Metheny began to search, first through acquaintances, then through crack houses, because he knew she used heroin, crack, and he knew the places where she usually bought. He went there at night, asked around, but no one had seen anything or simply didn't want to talk. Later, he finally found out from one of his acquaintances, through word of mouth, she had left for a dealer, a substance seller who ran a spot somewhere in the east of the city. She chose him, chose that world, chose what he could give her, and took their son there. Metheny never found them, not then, not later. And this moment he later described as a breaking point, not in the sense of depression or despair, but in the sense of some internal transformation. Something inside him switched, and the resentment, which in theory could have been worked through, processed and let go, turned into a hatred that could not be directed at one specific point. It's important to understand that he didn't hate her personally. He hated the type. Women who use, women who sell themselves, women who choose that lifestyle, and those men. In his mind, it turned into a category. No longer a personal story with a specific person, but a common enemy, abstract, and at the same time, very real. Metheny didn't talk about this in the bar after his shift, didn't complain to his colleagues at the factory. He didn't show at all that something inside had changed. On the outside, he remained the same, big, friendly, always ready to joke and help. But inside, a completely different program was already running. He continued to go out to the highway, continued to greet the women, but now he looked at them completely differently. As would later emerge during interrogations, he explained it this way. He didn't choose randomly. He chose those who looked like her, those who lived the same way, did the same things, and he saw her in each of them. This, of course, is not an excuse. It is a mechanism, a switch, after which a specific human being ceases to exist as a person and remains only a symbol. And a symbol can be destroyed endlessly because it never ends. It reproduces itself again and again. So, Metheny found his target, and she was everywhere, walking the highway every night. But for now, he was only watching and only planning. The push for the first step would be another event, under that very bridge where the homeless lived. He went under the Hanover Street Bridge because it was one of the places where she used to buy, and Metheny hoped to find at least someone who had seen where she went and with whom. In the camp, they recognized him. He had been there before. He didn't live there, of course, but he'd stop by, sometimes by, the big guy from the pallet factory who allowed himself to relax on weekends. Nothing special, nothing suspicious. He asked about his woman, described her appearance, showed a photo of his son, but no one helped. Whether they truly didn't know or just didn't want to talk to an outsider. Metheny returned several times, and each time received the same result: a shrug, blank stares, "Didn't see her, brother, don't know, can't help you." And so, on one of those nights, he came again, only this time he had an axe with him. Under the bridge, he found two men, Randall Brewer and Randy Piker. They had lived in the camp for a long time, knew practically everyone there, and they too said they knew nothing. Metheny didn't believe them, or maybe by that point, he just didn't care whether it was true or not. What happened next? He would later describe in interrogations calmly, almost mundanely. He eliminated them, both of them, with the axe right there under the bridge at night, with no witnesses. But there was a witness after all. On the riverbank, not far from the camp, a fisherman was sitting, and Metheny noticed him when he was already finishing. The fisherman might have seen, might not have seen. Metheny didn't stop to find out. 3 people in one night, the first on his list. He dumped them all into the Patapsco River. The current there is strong, and downstream is the industrial zone, the port, the exit to the Chesapeake Bay. And Metheny calculated correctly. The current carried them away, and nothing was ever found. Not then, not later. He was detained a few months later because someone finally informed on him. He had asked too many questions in the camp shortly before people disappeared from there. The police brought charges, the case went to court, and there it fell apart. No fines, no evidence, no weapon. Metheny had long ago disposed of the axe. No witnesses. The fisherman didn't surface either. All the prosecution had were circumstantial testimonies and the reputation of the camp, where people disappeared regularly and without any explanation. So, Metheny spent a year and a half awaiting trial and then walked free, acquitted for lack of evidence. He returned to the factory, to his trailer, to his work, to the women on the highway, everything as before, as if nothing had happened. Only now he knew one important thing for certain. You can eliminate a person, and there will be no consequence. The system doesn't work. No one looks. No one cares. And from that moment on, he stopped holding back. After his release, Metheny got a job at the same factory, and the owners didn't object. Formally, he was completely acquitted, his papers were clean, and he was a good worker. He didn't drink on shift, did everything required of him, and more. A year and a half in jail awaiting trial? Well, it happens. Who hasn't it happened to in a district like this? The trailer remained in its previous spot, and Metheny returned to it like it was home, as if nothing special had occurred. But something did change. Now he had an idea. Near the factory, right by the highway, was an empty space, a small patch between the truck stop and the gas station. Hundreds of cars drove past every day. Truckers stopped to refuel, stretch, have a bite to eat. But there was nowhere special to eat. The nearest decent diner was a 20-minute drive away. And so, Metheny reached an agreement with the factory owners, rented a corner of the property, set up a canopy, a couple of tables, a grill, and opened his own food stand. Burgers, sandwiches, coffee, everything simple, everything cheap, portions huge, prices lower than anywhere else in the area. The truckers appreciated it immediately. The stand took off quickly, because word of mouth along the highway works better than any advertising. Drivers tell each other where they can get a decent filling meal for a couple of dollars. And within a few months, Metheny already had regular customers, people who stopped specifically, turning off the main route for his burgers. It's important to understand that he worked completely alone. He bought the groceries himself, cooked himself, served the customers himself, and cleaned up himself after closing. No employees, no extra eyes, no one who could see anything unnecessary. And it looked absolutely logical. Small business, small margins. Why pay someone else if you can manage it yourself? The customers loved him. He joked with them, asked about their hauls and the road, wished them luck and a safe trip. A big, sociable guy, making honest burgers at an honest price. There was something authentic about it, especially for people who spend most of their lives behind the wheel and see only chain joints with the same plastic food around them. Metheny even had his own catchphrase. When customers praised the food and asked what the secret to such flavor was, he always answered the same way. The secret ingredient is love. Everyone laughed, and he laughed with them, broadly and sincerely. The stand flourished. Regular customers became more numerous, and meanwhile, the women along the highway continued to disappear one after another. 1995, then 1996. And the disappearances never stopped during all this time. They simply became part of the background, like the roar of the highway, like the horns of passing trucks, like the blinking neon signs of roadside motels. Among the women themselves, talk did happen between shifts, in the rooms of cheap motels, in the queue for morning coffee. Have you seen so-and-so? She hasn't shown up for a while. Maybe she went somewhere, maybe. And so by the end of 1996, if you added up all those maybes, it amounted to a lot. Too many for a simple coincidence. The versions that had circulated before still held. About the pimp from the East, about a bad batch, about those who simply left to start a new life. But the strangeness with the belongings wouldn't go away. The women weren't leaving for other states. They weren't lying unidentified in the city morgue. They weren't starting a new life somewhere far away. They were disappearing right here in this district and disappearing forever without any way to find out anything. But surely, if a person disappears, something must remain, some traces, some clues. If not in the morgue, if not in the river, then where? In 1995, something happened that by all logic should have stopped all of this once and for all. One of the women escaped. Her name has not been preserved in public materials, possibly suppressed at her own request. But the essence of what happened is documented in sufficient detail. She agreed to go with Metheny. He offered a ride, as he had done many times with others, and she knew him. Though everyone knew him, that was the problem. What exactly happened in the trailer, she would later tell the police. An attack, a struggle, an attempt to hold her by force? She somehow managed to break free. Or, according to another version, he let her go himself. The testimonies on this point diverge. But the main thing is that she got out of there alive. And so, she went to the station and filed a report. And for the first time in all these years, the police had something concrete. A living witness, the name of the attacker, an address, a place of work. Everything needed to open a full-scale case. The case was opened, Metheny was detained and interrogated, and it seemed that finally things would start moving. And then he was released. There wasn't enough evidence, her word against his word, and that turned out to be insufficient. She was a woman with a history of addiction and a corresponding lifestyle. He was a factory worker with a clean reputation who had never been noticed in anything of the sort. The court deemed the testimony insufficiently convincing. The case was closed, and he simply returned home, to his trailer, to his work. For the system, this was an absolutely routine case, one of thousands of reports that received no confirmation, one of many episodes that pass through stations and quietly disappear into archives, of no particular concern to anyone. For the woman, it was a true catastrophe. She had taken a risk. She had gone to the police despite her fear, and everything that it could have meant for her. She had named a specific name and told what they had done to her, and they simply didn't believe her. It's important to understand that for Metheny, this became a very specific signal. He understood the main thing. The people he chose as victims had no weight in the eyes of the law. Their words were not trusted. Their stories were not properly checked. And even if someone broke free and spoke up, nothing fundamentally would change. After 1995, the disappearances became more frequent. Not that they increased sharply. Metheny still remained cautious. But the intervals between the disappearances began to shorten. 3 months, then 2, then 1.5. The women on the highway knew nothing about that report. The story didn't spread around the area. The police didn't make it public. And the victim herself left town shortly after the court delivered its decision. To everyone around, Metheny remained who he was before, a good guy who ran a burger stand. He had gotten away with it again, and he intended to continue for as long as he could. For those who thought seriously about the disappearances, the main question wasn't, who is doing this? But something else entirely. How is this even possible? Suppose someone is doing this systematically. Suppose he is taking women one by one. But what happens next? How can you dispose of the traces when we're not talking about a single case? Hiding one person is difficult. 5 is almost impossible. And 10, that's a full-scale, logistical task that no one can handle, especially alone. And here is what's important to understand. All the classic options simply didn't work here. Bury them? For that, you need land. A lot of land. Private territory where no one goes and where no one will see anything. But an ordinary worker from a pallet factory doesn't have such land and can't. The yards in this district are overlooked. The vacant lots are communal. Someone is always around. Someone is passing through. Someone notices. The river? The current of the Patapsco is indeed strong, that's true. But water sooner or later brings things to the surface. Fishermen find them. Residents downstream report to the police. And over several years, at least something should have surfaced. At least some traces should have appeared. Burn them? For that, you need a furnace. You need time. You need a place where no one will notice either smoke or a characteristic smell. And Metheny lived in a trailer in the middle of an industrial zone, where dozens of people worked around him every day, and an open fire would have immediately raised questions. Take them somewhere far away? But Metheny worked every day without days off. He was seen at the factory morning and evening. He was seen at the burger stand until late at night. He didn't go on long trips, didn't disappear for several days. His schedule was absolutely transparent to everyone who knew him. So, it was an impossible equation that just wouldn't add up. A man whom everyone knows, who is constantly in sight, who has neither the resources nor the opportunity, and yet regularly eliminates people without a single trace. The math just didn't work, and that is exactly why no one seriously thought it was him, even those who tried to figure out what was happening. If someone had said out loud, "Maybe it's Tiny from the pallet factory," they would have been laughed at. How is that possible? He's here every day. He's always in sight. He doesn't go anywhere. And besides, people like that don't do such things. It's just ridiculous. The perfect camouflage worked not because Metheny was some kind of exceptional trickster or a planning genius. It worked because people simply couldn't imagine how such a thing was even technically possible to pull off. But it was possible, and the answer all this time was right in plain sight, literally before everyone's eyes. It could even be tasted, for just a couple of dollars, with a huge portion and a smile to boot. The roadside stand worked every day without a break, and Metheny would get up even before dawn, prep for the whole day, and open by 6 in the morning, just when the first truckers were starting to leave their overnight stops. His breakfast was simple: coffee, scrambled eggs, bacon sandwiches. Nothing extra, everything filling and fast. By lunchtime, the burgers would appear, big, juicy, with fried onions and cheap processed cheese, and in the evening, he would sell what was left at a reduced price, so that nothing went to waste or was thrown away. Customers valued this consistency because in the world of the highway, where everything flashes past the window and changes every hour, predictability itself becomes of value. Metheny remembered the regulars, asked about their hauls, knew who was coming from where, who was hauling what, who was married, who had back problems from long hours at the wheel. He was a good listener, and that's a rare quality in places where everyone is always in a rush and no one cares about anyone. Sometimes customers would jokingly ask for the secret recipe, wonder where he got meat of such quality at such prices, and Metheny always answered the same: fresh, local, no freezing, everything honest. People nodded and continued to eat. Fresh is good. Local is even better. What else is there to ask? And here's what's interesting. His prices were below market and inexplicably lower if you think about the economics of the process. No, people didn't think. The low prices were perceived as a gift, and it's not customary to analyze gifts. The stand brought in money, not huge amounts, but quite stable. Metheny paid the rent to the factory owners, bought supplies, kept the equipment in order, and the business worked. Everything turned as it should. In the evenings, he would close the stand and return to his trailer, and there no one waited for him. No one checked on him, and no one asked where he went at night, if he went at all. And he did go. Not every night, of course, but regularly enough. He knew which of the women was new and who hadn't been seen in those parts yet, who would trust him faster than others and wouldn't ask unnecessary questions. The next morning, he would open his stand again, turn on the grill and begin another workday, exactly like the one before. Customers would stop by, smile at him, pay their dollars, eat his burgers, and drive on about their business. And not one of them even suspected what was actually happening. July 1994, and Metheny met her at night on the highway. Her name was Catherine Magaziner, 39 years old. A story absolutely typical for that district. Addiction, several arrests for minor things, no connections that would hold her in one place or cause anyone to worry about her. He offered a ride. She agreed, and they went to his trailer. What happened there? He would tell in an interrogation 2 years later. Calmly, methodically, without any emotion, as if describing an ordinary workday at the factory, or the process of preparing another batch of burgers. So, Catherine became one of those who disappeared without a single trace and without a single question from the authorities. No one filed a report about her disappearance. Colleagues on the highway noticed her absence, shrugged, and decided that she had probably gone somewhere, as often happened there. The police knew nothing, and either there was no family or Catherine hadn't communicated with them for a long time, and no one was going to look for her. Metheny buried her on the factory grounds, not deep, very close to the trailer, and a few months later returned, dug her up, separated the head, put it in a box, and threw it away with the ordinary trash. The rest he buried in a different place, so as not to keep everything next to each other. He acted without haste and without panic, like a man who knows for sure that no one will come here with an inspection and no one will suspect anything. In November 1996, it was Kimberly Spicer, 23 years old, and the story repeated almost exactly. Night, highway, an offer of a ride, agreement, and a trip to the trailer. The ending turned out to be the same, only the weapon this time was different. A knife instead of what he had used before. And here is what's important to understand. He kept Kimberly on the factory grounds for almost a whole month. He didn't bury her immediately, but waited for something. Or maybe just didn't want to finish the process too quickly. Between these two dates, there were other cases, and Metheny later named different numbers during interrogations: 7, 10, 13, depending on when and to whom he was telling it. The police were never able to establish the exact number because most of the episodes had no confirmation. No fines, no witnesses, no missing persons reports, nothing at all except his own words. No two cases, Catherine and Kimberly, were enough for the case to finally move from its spot. Or almost enough. Because in December 1996, Metheny made a mistake. Not his first during all this time, but the first that would bring about real consequences. It was December 1996, and her name was Rita Kemper. She agreed to enter the trailer because Metheny offered to share a dose. And in that area, such a thing was absolutely normal practice. People shared when they had something, and no one saw anything suspicious or strange in it. Once inside the trailer, he attacked her. Rita fought back, and much harder than he had anticipated. He beat her, dragged her back inside, tried to undress her, and at one point, according to her testimony, he said the phrase that changed everything. "I'll bury you in the woods, next to the others." She heard this and immediately realized that if she stayed there, she wouldn't make it out alive, that the others meant exactly what it meant, and that every minute counted. Rita somehow managed to reach the window, broke the glass, and climbed out. It was dark and cold outside. She was wounded and could barely stand. But she ran until she saw a patrol car and stopped it. The police arrived at the trailer that same night, and Metheny simply didn't have time to hide anything or prepare. Near the trailer, right on the factory grounds, were the fragments of Kimberly Spicer. He hadn't finished burying her. He wasn't in any hurry at all, and now he suddenly had no time to fix anything. He was arrested on December 15th, 1996, around 2 in the morning, and the official charge initially sounded like assault and attempted coercion, though later, of course, other much more serious counts were added. During the first interrogation, he was silent at first, refusing to answer questions, and then suddenly he started talking. The investigators were prepared for the standard procedure: a lawyer, complete denial of guilt, long bargaining over every point of the indictment, and so on. But Metheny didn't bargain. He began to tell the story himself, and willingly in great detail, with specifics that no one had even asked him for. He talked about Kimberly, then about Catherine, then about others, naming specific locations, giving dates, describing exactly what he did and in what sequence. At first, the investigators didn't understand what was happening at all, because the man brought in for attacking a woman was sitting before them, calmly listing cases that no one was even investigating and that no one even suspected. And then they realized he was bragging. He showed no remorse for anything, did not try to explain his actions through circumstances or justify himself to those listening. He spoke the way people usually speak about their achievements and successes, with noticeable pride, with clear pleasure at finally being able to share it all. The interrogation was interrupted several times, not because Metheny refused to continue or demanded a lawyer, but because those sitting across from him, listening to it all, simply couldn't go on and needed a break to pull themselves together. Metheny spoke for hours. Investigators took turns, one after another, going for breaks and returning with new questions, and he just kept going and going, as if he had been waiting for this moment for a long time. He spoke about the bridge on Hanover Street, about 2 homeless people and a fisherman who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, about the axe he later threw away, about the river that swept away everything that needed to be swept away. The police checked this information and found nothing, but Metheny spoke so confidently and with such specific details that there was practically no doubt left. He had indeed been there and had indeed done what he described. He described the women from the highway in detail and explained exactly how he chose his next targets. The criteria were simple and cynical. Those with addictions, the lonely, those without family who would look for them, without friends who would raise the alarm, the ones no one would miss. The investigation found fragments of Catherine Magaziner, where he indicated, though they had to dig twice, the first time he either made a mistake with the exact spot or intentionally pointed slightly to the side to stall for time. Identification was made through dental records, but the head was never found. In that part, he told the truth about the dumpster. Kimberly Spicer was found on the factory grounds, but only partially, not everything that should have been there. The others he spoke about could not be found. Metheny named specific places: the river, vacant lots on the outskirts, various sections of the factory grounds. The police searched, checking every point, but there were no results. Either he was lying and exaggerating the scale, or he had hidden everything much better than he described during the interrogations. Or there was a third option that the investigators hadn't even considered at first. These people no longer existed in a form in which they could be found at all. And then, at some stage of the interrogation, one of the investigators asked the question that had been haunting everyone since the moment of the arrest. "We understand how you found them. We understand what happened next. But what did you do with the rest? Because one person can still be hidden somehow, but you're talking about 10. So where are they all?" Metheny was silent for a few seconds, and then asked in return, "Did you ever stop by my stand? Did you try my burgers?" The investigator didn't immediately understand what he was talking about and asked him to repeat it. Metheny repeated it, and this time he was smiling. He didn't explain everything right away. First, he just watched the investigator's reaction and clearly enjoyed the ensuing pause. When asked to clarify exactly what he meant, Metheny only shook his head, as if to say, "Figure it out yourself. I've said enough already." And then he told them anyway, in detail, and without any sign of embarrassment. He butchered them in the trailer at night. After he finished with the main part, cut them into pieces, separating what could be used from what needed to be thrown away or hidden. The bones, which were impossible to grind, he buried in various places or sank in the river, and everything else he processed in a very specific way. He ground it into mince, mixed it with pork and beef that he bought in bulk from local suppliers, formed patties, and from the patties made those very burgers that he later sold at his roadside stand. And this went on for years. Hundreds of people, thousands of servings, and not one of them ever suspected exactly what they were eating. The investigator left the room without listening to the end, while Metheny remained in his seat, calm and clearly pleased with the effect he had produced. He had been waiting for this moment, the moment when he could finally tell everything and see the reaction on the faces of those listening to him. And here is what is important to understand. This was not just disposal and not a practical solution to the problem of what remained after his nightly activities. It was a continuation, the final act, the thing for which everything else made sense to him. He explained this later in a letter he wrote from prison. He wanted to humiliate them to the very end, to turn them into what he believed they were, into trash, literally into waste that people ate, digested, and expelled from their bodies, not knowing and never knowing the truth. It was about power, about absolute control over those he hated, a control that continued even after they ceased to exist as human beings. He stood behind the counter, watched people eat his burgers, smiled at them, wished them a good trip, and all the while knew something they didn't know and would never know. And this knowledge was his main reward, the reason he started it all in the first place. The secret ingredient is love. Now, that signature phrase of his sounded completely different. When information about exactly what Metheny had said during the interrogations leaked beyond the walls of the detention center, first in whispers among those working on the case, then officially, the reaction was not at all what might be expected from such a story. There was no wave of publications in major outlets, no television crews at the factory gates, no loud headlines on the front pages. And it wasn't due to a lack of evidence or doubts about credibility. The investigation had documented absolutely everything. A full confession, detailed testimony, fragments found in the places he indicated. The mechanism was clear, the chronology reconstructed, the scale understood by anyone who reviewed the materials. The problem lay elsewhere, and no one knew how to solve it. How to even tell this story in a way that ordinary people could process it. You see, a standard crime narrative works according to a certain formula. A crime is committed, an investigation follows, punishment ensues, and the viewer sympathizes with the victims, follows the work of the police, and in the end feels relief when the villain is caught. Here, the formula broke down at every stage. The victims were women whom the system had long since written off, and it was difficult to sympathize with them in the traditional sense. Most readers simply didn't see them as their own. The investigation was a total failure. The police didn't notice anything for years until one of the victims literally escaped through a window and led a patrol to the trailer. Most importantly, the viewer inevitably became part of the story, whether they wanted to or not. Anyone who drove along that highway in those years, anyone who might have stopped at a roadside food stand, anyone who ate burgers by the road and didn't think twice about why the meat was priced that way. How do you write a piece that makes thousands of people wonder, could I have been there too? Editors came to one conclusion. It was better not to write at all. In the end, one short note appeared in a local newspaper, a brief announcement of the sentence, and then total silence. The legal process stretched over 2 years, and it involved several separate cases, several different charges, and several sentences that were handed down sequentially, one after another. The assault on Rita Kemper was considered first. That was 1997, and Metheny received 50 years for kidnapping and attempted coercion. The attempted murder charge could not be confirmed because the investigation lacked evidence of direct intent, although everyone understood how it would have ended if she hadn't escaped. Second was the Kimberly Spicer case, already in 1998, and the jury found him guilty of a premeditated act with aggravating circumstances. The sentence was the maximum penalty. At the sentencing, he showed no reaction at all, sat perfectly still, looked at the judge, and when given the final word, said what would later be quoted in all materials about this case. You won't hear the word sorry from me, because that would be a lie. I liked what I was doing, and I got pleasure from it. The courtroom was silent. No one knew how to react to that. Later that same year, he pleaded guilty in the Catherine Magaziner case. This was a plea deal, a life sentence instead of a second death sentence. and the prosecutors agreed to these terms because proving all over again what had already been proven in the previous trial simply had no practical point. The final result of all the legal proceedings looked like this: 2 life terms without any possibility of parole, plus 50 years on top for the first case. Other episodes he had detailed during interrogations never made it to court because a simple rule applies: no remains, no case. 3 proven instances, at least 7, according to his own testimony, and possibly significantly more. No one ever established the exact figure. Metheny was transferred to the Western Correctional Institution in Cumberland, Maryland, a maximum security facility, solitary confinement, no contact with other prisoners. Then, in 2001, an appeals court unexpectedly overturned the previously issued death sentence in the Spicer case. The reason turned out to be purely technical. The qualifying factor, specifically robbery, was not proven as the primary motive for his actions. It is important to understand that Metheny did all this not for money or any material gain. He acted for the sake of the process itself, for the feeling of power and control. And this is what ultimately worked in his favor in a legal sense. The sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. He remained where he was, in the same cell, under the same conditions. Only a line in the documents changed. And that was when he began writing letters. Many letters to different people. And these letters would become a separate part of his story. From prison, Metheny wrote much and willingly to journalists, researchers, criminologists, and random people who sent him questions out of curiosity or for their own projects. He answered everyone in detail and thoroughly. And in these responses, one could feel a pleasure that was impossible to hide, even through dry text on paper. One of his letters later circulated widely on the internet and is still quoted in materials about the case today. In it, he described the entire process in detail: how he chose, how he acted, how he then prepared what remained. And he wrote about all of this perfectly calmly, methodically, with a dark humor that literally turned the stomach of any normal reader. He explained that when you mix it with pork in the right proportions, no one can tell the difference. The taste is almost identical. People ate and praised it, asked for the recipe, and he would give them his favorite line about the secret ingredient, and they would laugh, not understanding exactly what they were laughing at. He gave interviews to those few journalists and researchers who dared to visit him at the prison, sitting on the other side of the glass and speaking in the same tone he had used during interrogations immediately after his arrest. When asked why he chose that particular method, he answered directly. He wanted them to cease to exist completely, not just disappear somewhere, but literally stop being. And this, according to him, was a fair finale. Fair. That was the word he used. And he sincerely believed that these women deserved everything that happened to them because they resembled the one who had left him. The letters are preserved in archives. The interviews are also recorded and documented. All of this can be found in open sources if one wishes. Metheny remained in his cell, continued to write replies to incoming letters, and patiently waited for someone else to want to hear his story firsthand. On August 5, 2017, guards at the Western Correctional Institution found Metheny in his cell with no signs of life. This happened around 3 in the afternoon. An official cause was not named immediately, but later a version appeared that it was his own decision to end his journey in this way, and the investigation found no signs of external interference or anyone else's involvement. He was 62 years old, and he had spent just over 20 years behind bars. Almost all of that time in a solitary cell with minimal contact with the outside world. And here is what is important to understand. In all those years, he never once expressed regret for what he had done, never once asked anyone for forgiveness. Local newspapers published short obituaries, literally a few lines long, without details and without reminders of what he had actually been doing all those years before his arrest. The Joe Stein and Son factory has long since closed, the territory passed to other owners who may not even know its history. The trailer was demolished back in the 90s, immediately after he was taken away, and the place where the burger stand once stood is now just part of a faceless industrial zone, and nothing there reminds anyone of what happened on that very spot 20-odd years ago. But the people who were part of this story haven't gone anywhere. The truck drivers who drove that highway in the mid-90s and regularly stopped there. The blue-collar workers from night shifts who stopped for a bite on their way home. The random passers-by who praised the large portions and were surprised by such low prices. Those who laughed at his signature joke about the secret ingredient and drove on in a good mood. All these people live their ordinary lives, and many of them don't even suspect that this story even exists because it was never really told to the general public. Or they know about it in general terms, but don't connect it to themselves personally. Don't stop to think that they themselves could have been among those customers. Or perhaps they do connect it. And try with all their might not to think about it, because some thoughts are better kept far away from one's consciousness. You see, Metheny left behind a question that is impossible to answer honestly. A question that concerns everyone who ever drove through that area in those years and might have stopped at a roadside spot for cheap food. Could I have been there too? For thousands of people, the answer to that question is possibly, and they will never know for sure. This story is fully documented and is in the public domain for anyone who wants to become acquainted with it, but almost no one talks about it. And that in itself is surprising for a case of such magnitude. There is no documentary series with reconstructions of events, no best-selling book by a famous author, no podcast with millions of listens. Perhaps the reason is that there is simply no hero here in the usual sense of the word. No investigator who solved a complex puzzle and tracked down the criminal through their professionalism. No relative of a victim who sought justice for years. No moment at all when the system finally worked as it should. Maybe it's because the victims are not at all the kind of people about whom movies are made and books are written. Women from the highway, with addictions, without families who would look for them, without a voice that anyone would hear. Or maybe the reason is even simpler. This story is too uncomfortable for everyone who comes into contact with it. After all, it's not about a monster who hid somewhere in the shadows and only came out at night. It's about a monster who stood in plain sight for years, smiled at every visitor, took money for food, and wished them a good trip. And it's about all those who passed by and noticed nothing, who ate, who paid, who didn't ask unnecessary questions. You see, we are used to thinking that true evil is always something distant, that it happens somewhere else, to someone completely different, and that it doesn't and will never affect us personally. The story of Joe Metheny says exactly the opposite. Evil can calmly stand behind a counter, can smile at you, and hand you your change. And you will never know for sure exactly who you are dealing with, because some things cannot be seen until it is too late. Because some stories never make the news, not because they aren't important or interesting, but because they are too important and too close to every one of us.